Hello dear students, welcome to the first lecture of the processing of the data. The first chapter we discuss what are the basic elements in the research, and second chapter regarding the sampling, and third chapter discussing different methods for collecting the primary data. And this chapter we are going to discuss how to processing your the data. What different stages are relating with your the processing of the data. And this lecture are focusing on the first important element is editing, and what you mean by this editing, and what are methods of editing, and what are the editing rules. These are the major contents of this lecture. Okay, let us start. What you mean by the term is the processing of the data. Okay, as a researcher point of view, one of the important element is the processing of the data. The data can be processed through the different stages. Suppose you are preparing the questionnaire, and after that you are editing, and you are the coding, and you are the classifying, and the tabulating, and the graphical representation, and after the data cleaning and the data adjustment. These are the different steps are involving the processing of the data. Okay, as a researcher is always trying to create the good questionnaire for the effective study. After the questionnaire, you get a lot of the data, and the first important element is the editing of the data. After the data collected through the questionnaire, the researcher is always focusing on the editing of the data. And after the editing, the next we focusing on the coding. That means assigning the numbers, symbol for the data. That is a coding. And third step is a classification. The classification means arranging the similar data. And after the tabulating form, that's data in tabular format. That is tabulation. And we can use the graphical representation. That means figures, the graphs, the histograms, and all the important element of the graphical representation. And you clean the data. That means identify the mistakes and make the adjustments. These are the processing of the data. So here we are discussing what we mean by this editing. This lecture we are going to discuss what we mean by this editing. And what is an editing? As a research point of view, the one of the important element is editing of data. The editing is the most important element in the processing of the data. What is an editing? Suppose collecting the data through the questionnaire, and what you mean by the term is editing. Okay, so listen, editing means it's like a process of involve the review and adjustment of the collected data. That means it's like a process of reviewing or the adjusting the collected data. That means you're collecting the data through the questionnaire. You suppose you're collecting the load of the data through the questionnaire. That means you are using the questionnaire for the primary purpose, the primary point of view, and collecting the lot of the information through the questionnaire or the schedules or any other methods. And the first important element must be coded. Suppose you not to perform the good analysis, we must editing the data and the coding of the data. The first we desired edit process. Edit process means make an adjustment for the coding. That's the first important element of the processing of the data. The data editing is defined as a process involving the review and adjustment of the collected survey data. This purpose is to control the quality of the collected data, and the data editing can be performed manually with assistance of the computer or the combination of the both. Okay, so we can perform the data editing with help of the computers or otherwise manually. Or suppose lot of organizations are appointing the qualified persons for editing of the data. So like the Siemens and the Rand Baxi, they conducted a lot of the primary study, and not to completing their study, the editing is very essential element. So the editor post is most important element of the research activity. So they are appointing a lot of the qualified editor for the completing the process. Suppose taking the newspaper, the chief editor role is very important element. As a chief, what is the role of chief editor? Can you guess what is the role of the chief editor? The chief editor always editing and scrutinizing the data collected by the reporter. The reporter collecting a lot of data for that newspaper, and the editor is editing the relevant elements. That means it must be taking only the relevant element and eliminating the unnecessary information from the information of the report. It will bring by the reporter. Okay, so that is the logic of this editing. So editing is an essential element in the research activity. Okay, and what are the methods of the editing? Okay, the researchers argue that a lot of the methods of the editing. I am discussing some important methods of the editing. And the first important category of editing is interactive editing, and second one is selective editing, and third one is the macro editing, and the fourth one is automatic editing. The macro editing point of view, the two important method, one is aggregation method and the distribution method. These are the most commonly used editing methods in the research activities. So first of all, interactive editing, and selective editing, macro editing. Then the macro editing is included the aggregation editing and distribution editing, and another one is automatic editing. Okay, let us discuss one by one what you mean by the interactive editing, selective, macro, and the automatic. The first one, what do you mean by this interactive editing? So interactive editing means you are using a lot of the computer assisted assistance for the purpose of editing. The term of the editing is known as the interactive editing. So interactive editing is a most commonly used method for the scientific organization. So like the National Institute of Statistical Institute, and also the different level of the National Institute are using the interactive editing method. That means they are using the modern computer assistance for the purpose of the editing. That category of editing is known as the interactive editing. That means, as one of the example, I quoted one example, National Institute allow 1 week check the specified edit during or after the data entry. If the necessary to correct the anonymous data immediately. That means the checking process. This type of the editing is always ensuring the reliability of the data. Suppose you're collecting a lot of data, and then interactive editing is performed by the computer. The computer is performedly manual assistance. That means the human support is essential for the computer editing. So used for the modern computer assisted manual editing. Okay, this category of the editing is known as the interactive editing. So this is the first category of the editing. This term is known as a commonly used term. Is mainly used for the modern computer assisted manual editing. Okay, that means using the computer and the manual editing process. And the second category is the selective editing. And second category is selective editing. The selective editing means, suppose you have the time is constrained. Sometime you are performing editing activity, the time is constrained. So we select certain elements only for the completing the activity. That category of the editing is known as the selective editing. So selective editing is a technique aims to apply the interactive editing to well chosen subset of the records. That means it's a part of the interactive editing. The selective editing are performed from the interactive editing. That means techniques apply the interactive editing to well chosen subset of the records, such that limited times of the resources are available for the interactive editing. That means that's the basic element. Suppose your time and your resource constraints as part of the interactive editing, we can use the selective editing. So that's category of the editing is known as the selective editing. Are allotted to the records where it has to most effect on the quality of the final estimate of the publication of the figures. So that is the suppose when we face any limitation performing the interactive editing, we can depend the selective editing. And these are two important streams of selective editing. One is a critical stream, another one is a non-critical stream. These are two category of the elements. Two categories are related with the selective editing. We can perform the critical streams and can be performed the non-critical stream. Okay, these are the parts of the selective editing, and selective editing is always relating with your interactive editing, and that means the technique is apply the interactive editing a well chosen subset of this record, such that the limited time and the resources available for the interactive editing. We can focusing on the selective editing. Okay, so that is the first category is interactive editing, and second one is the selective editing. And third category of the method is macro editing. What is the macro editing? The macro editing performed two ways. One is aggregation method, another one is a distribution method. A macro editing, that's performing the two way. The one is aggregation point of view, and another one is a distribution point of view. And aggregation means it's verifying whether the figures to be published seem plausible. That means is a dependable, because the data editing is always relating with a lot of the figures. We are collecting the lot of the figures to the questionnaire, and we just editing these figures, and we have ensuring that whether figures to be published is implausible. Plausibility, the checking these figures are is it believable or not, is from right sources, can decide with help of the aggregation method. And this method followed the most every statistical agency before the publication. Is one of the, suppose you're publishing the paper in the international journal, they must ensure the aggregation method. That means its the figures are reliable or not, and which is the source of these figures, always relating with this activity. So this category, the editing, is known as the aggregation method of the editing. This is accomplished by the comparing the quantities in the publication tables and same quantity in the previous publication. That's counter checking that each and every figures relating with your the data. That category of the editing is known as the aggregation. And another method of the editing is known as the distribution method. That means here there is a data available is used to characterize the distribution of the variable. That means you're focusing on certain variable, you're collecting the data based on certain variables. The variables are very important element. Variables frame data collect. For suppose you are collecting the data related to age. Age is one of the important independent variable. Age related to the data records containing the values that could be considered for the uncommon or candidate for the further inspection and the possibility of editing. That means you are ensuring this variable. The data characterizing the lot of the variables. The data variables variables relate to the data collect distribution pattern load ensure the distribution methods. It's a part of the macro editing. These are two important elements of the macro editing. One is the aggregation point of view, another one the distribution point of view. That means the distribution characterizes the distribution of the variables, and here there is aggregation verifying the figures. And the last category of the editing is the automatic editing. Automatic editing means the computer without human intervention. So what this is logic, this automatic, this is purely performed by the computer. And in the interactive editing, we are using the computer and assisted manual editing. We are using the man and the computer combination. And here this automatic is purely performed by the computer. That's without the human intervention. That category of the editing is known as the automatic editing. And putting the data into separate software, and this software is performing in the each and every activities. That category of editing is known as the automatic editing. Okay, so this category is mainly used by the professional for the logical purpose, and some of the medias are using the automatic editing process for the completing their activities. Okay, these are the different methods of the editing. So once again, the first category editing is interactive editing. The interactive editing, we use a modern computer assisted manual editing. That's really using the computer and with help of the manuals. And the second one is selective editing. The selective editing, that means suppose the time is constrained, we can use a selective editing. That is a part of the interactive editing. These two streams are relating with the selective editing. One is the critical and one is a non-critical stream. And another method is the macro editing. The macro editing classifies that one is aggregation, another one is the distribution. So aggregation methods, that means it depends upon the figures. The distribution methods is focusing on the characters and distribution of the variables. The last category is automatic editing. That means edited by the computer without the human intervention. That category editing is known as the automatic editing. Okay, these are the important methods are used for this editing. Okay, let us discuss what are the objectives of this editing. The first we discuss different methods of editing, and the next we discussing what the important objectives of the editing. The first important objective of editing is editing always have the detection of the errors. The process of the editing is always at the researcher to identify the errors in the data collection. This is the first important objective. Can easily identify any mistakes of the data collection with help of the editing. And the second one is validating the data. The second important objective of the editing means validation. The validation means the data is collected from the right source or not. It can be easily validated with help of the editing. So that is second important objective is the validation of the data. And third one is the provision of the information that would help assess the overall level of the accuracy of the data. We can measure the accuracy of the data with help of the editing. So accuracy, that means it is the right information. Validation is all with help of the data, with help of this editing. We can be easily measure the accuracy of the data can be helpful for the future purpose, can be easily used for the current purpose, that can be decided with help of your the editing. So that means accuracy is one of the important element of the editing. And another one is the detection and identifying the inconsistency of the data. That means if suppose any mistakes as part of the data collection, that's a inconsistent element. Suppose certain information may be inconsistent, we can be easily identify the inconsistency with help of your the editing. These are the important objectives of the editing. The first one is the help to detecting the errors, and second one is the validation of the data and the provision of the information, that means the overall level of the accuracy. And another one is the inconsistency can be identified with help of the editing. These are the objectives of the editing. Okay, then after the what are steps for the editing? The research point of view, what are the important steps are prepared by the researcher for the editing. And basic two important steps of the editing. Suppose you frame the editing rules are essential. Editor rule is very essential, so must be conscious about these activities. And basically the stages are classified into two. That there is a two steps. That means the stages are further divided. The first stage of where you set the rules for the editing. That's the first important stage. This is only the first stage. There's where we set the rules for the editing. The stage is further subdivided into two steps. There's one of the first steps. There's only the first important step is the stage where you start the rules for the editing. That means it can be subdivided into the two steps. The first one is providing the right instruction to the desk editors. Suppose you're a researcher, you're appointing the editors for the editor for editing the data. You must be give the right information to the editor. There's a desk editor. Provide the instruction to the desk editor, and who then check the data for the coherence. That means the systematic side and the consistency. So that's the first important steps of the editing. That means give the proper instruction to the editors regarding the consistency and coherence of your the data. And step 2, that is another important step. This first stage is already discussed. The stage is the subdivided two steps. The first step is provide the instruction to the desk editors, and second step is you set the rules of establishing the logical relation between the variable. And second step is you must be communicating with the editor what are the important variables are used in your study, and to make the logical connection between these variables according to the criteria. Set rule called the automated validation rules, and this type of edit seeks to detect the errors and during the data entry and the screening. That means as a researcher point of view, first you give the instruction to the editors. Editors ചെയ്യുന്ന ആക്ടിവിറ്റീസ് നമ്മൾ ഇൻസ്ട്രക്ഷൻ കൊടുക്കണം, ഇങ്ങനെ എഡിറ്റ് ചെയ്യണം. അതുമാത്രമല്ല എഡിറ്ററിൻ്റെ അത് കമ്മ്യൂണിക്കേറ്റ് ചെയ്യണം, എന്താണ് റിലേഷൻഷിപ്പ് വിത്ത് ദ വാരിയബിൾസ്. ഈ സ്റ്റെപ്സിൽ കൂടെ കടന്നു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ മാത്രമേ എഡിറ്റിംഗ് സക്സസ് ആവുള്ളൂ. The first stage, it is only the first stage that you set the rules for the editing, and this stage further subdivided in two steps. One is the provide the instruction to the editors, and another one is establishing the logical relation between the variables for your the study. Okay, so these are the important steps regarding your the editing. So these are steps of the editing. They've already discussed what are the important objectives. Objectives always have to identify the inconsistency of the data, and the editing is steps of editing. One of the important element is to give the instruction to the editors, and how you set the rule for establishing your edit and make the logical connection between the variable. These are two important elements associated with your the editing. And what are the drawbacks of the editing? Suppose you are performing the editing process, a lot of the limitations. So let's discuss what are the limitation of the editing. പലപ്പോഴും വരാറുണ്ട് എഡിറ്റ് ചെയ്യേണ്ട സമയത്ത് ഒരുപാട് ലിമിറ്റേഷൻസ് നമുക്ക് ഫേസ് ചെയ്യാറുണ്ട്. And what are the drawbacks of this editing? The first drawback is the data editing can be influenced by the amount of time is available. That time constraints is a very important element. Suppose you are editing the lot of the data, the time is limited. Suppose you are an editor, you are the researcher and you are the editor. That means you get a lot of the information to the question. Suppose the time is constrained, your editing may be not well done. That means not systematically done. Suppose the time is very important element for the completing the editing activity. Suppose insufficient time is always created the insufficient editing. So that's the first important drawback of the editing. It is the time availability, the constraints, the chance for the limitation, the time limitation as part of the editing. Okay, that's the first drawback. That's the time is limited sometime. And second one is available computer software programs, because you use using the automated editing process that depending on the computers and the computer softwares. The inavailability of the computer software programs will be creating the lot of the difficulties in the process of the editing. So there is a second limitation, that's inadequate computer software program. And third one is follow-up is essential. Suppose you are giving suppose you are a researcher and giving the work to the editor, you must be follow up the entire activities of the respondents who are performance. The follow-up with the respondents is critically important, and similarly you just follow up with the activities of the respondents. Sometimes this activity is a very difficult element. That's another drawback faced relating with the editing. Follow up with the respondents, so critical importance. And another drawback is to make sure that the more important part of the data that kept free from the all errors must be ensure the entire activities are free from the all errors. That may not be possible because the errors is a part of the data collection. You can't avoid the entire errors in the data collection. So that is may not be ensure that all the data is free from the errors. That is another drawback of the editing. These are the drawbacks of the editing. The first drawback is the time is very limited element. Another one is the lack of availability of the computer software program, and the follow-up with the respondents is another important drawback, and to make sure that all the important part of the data are kept free from the error. These are the basic drawbacks of the limitation of the editing. Okay, and what are the purpose of editing and why we are conducting the process of editing? What are the basic purpose of this editing? As a research point of view, what are the purpose of editing? Okay, the first important purpose is to clarify the responses. The first important of the clarify, suppose you are getting the lot of the response through the questionnaire. So the editing is always clarify this response. With editing the data, the researcher makes sure that all the responses are now very clear and understand. So the first important purpose of the editing is to clarify your responses, because this data is used for the analysis. So must be ensure this data is clear and easily understand. This is the first important purpose of the editing is to clarify response of the respondents. And second one is make the omissions. To must be avoid unnecessary data in the editing process. Editing is always help to eliminate unsuitable data for the analysis. So you can omitting the data which are not relevant to your study. The editors always need to make some omission of the responses. By chance, some mistakes, some responses are left incomplete. There is a possibility that some responses are incomplete certain situations. So we can be easily avoid with the help of this editing. This is make the omissions. The first one is to clarify the responses, and second one is to make the omission, and third one is to avoid the biased editing. And editing is that avoid sometimes there is a bias error. There's chance for the bias because the inexperience of the editor creating the bias. The editor has great responsibility to edit the survey the data other from the responses. Editor need to very objectives. That means he is not subjective, he is objective in part of the editing, and should not try to hide or remove any information. A good editor may not try to hide any information. So avoid this type of the bias with help of the editing. So okay, that is a fourth important purpose of the avoid the bias of the editing. And another one is check the handwriting. Handwriting issues sometimes is very relevant in the editing process. So the editor can be resolved some extent this problem. So the handwriting issues can be solved with the help of the editing and easily identify which is recorded rightly. Some people write very fast, and they in this way they write so that comprehensions of the test difficult can easily read the writing stage. ചില ഇൻഫോർമേഷൻ നമുക്കറിയാം പലപ്പോഴും ക്ലിയർ ആയിട്ട് വായിക്കാൻ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ക്ലിയർ ആയിട്ട് മനസ്സിലാക്കാൻ സാധിക്കില്ല. അപ്പം അങ്ങനത്തെ ഇഷ്യൂസ് പലപ്പോഴും എഡിറ്റിംഗ് സ്റ്റേജിൽ വരും. അപ്പോൾ അതുകൊണ്ട് എഡിറ്റിംഗ് ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ ഒരു പരിധി വരെ അങ്ങനത്തെ കാര്യങ്ങളൊക്കെ വളരെയധികം കൃത്യമായിട്ട് ഇപ്പോൾ ചെയ്ത ആൾ എന്താണ് ചെയ്യാത്തതെന്ന് അറിഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അവരോട് ചോദിച്ചത് കംപ്ലീറ്റ് ചെയ്യാൻ നമുക്ക് സാധിക്കും. So check the handwriting. So these are the important purpose of the editing. So once again, the first one is to clarify the responses, to make the omissions, avoid the biased editing, and the check the handwriting. These are the important the purpose of your the editing. Okay, fine. We're discussing the different editing rules. As a researcher engaging the process of editing, and what are the important rules to be considered for the editing. The first important rule is the experience of the staff members in the editing. That means your staff members are the expertise in the field of this editing. So otherwise we face a lot of the difficulty at the time of the editing. That's the first important rule, is the experience, expertise of your staff members. And second one is the editing rules are the consistent and the free from the contradictions. That must be ensure that all the rules are the free from the contradictions. And a third important rule is take into account all the variable, that means dependent and independent variable in terms of quantity and the qualitative is setting for the editings. That means ensure that variables are included at the time of the editing. Another one is time is essential element to ensure the enough time given for the completing of your activity. The time, that's another important rule. And the quick checking is needed and of the each process or the each stage, and the editor must be ensure the quick check in the each stage or the process. And another one is the data must be free from the errors. Editor always ensure that the collected data is free from the errors. And the last one is questionnaire must also be subject to the test of the editing. The questionnaire is always edited at the time of the editing stage. That means counter checking. The questionnaires are counter checking with the data. So these are the important rules of the editing. That means the experience of the staff members, and the always the rules are the consistent contradictions, and that variables, and enough times giving the complete of an activity. The quick check is needed, and that's make sure that the data almost free, and find one your question must be subject to the detailed desk of the editing. Okay, these are the important rules of regarding the editing. Let me conclude. The first we discuss what he mean by this processing of the data. The processing of the data means you are starting with the preparation of the questionnaire, and you are collecting the data, and you are editing, you coded the data, the classification, the tabulation, the graphical representation, data cleaning, and the data adjustments. And the first one is what you mean by the editing of the data. Editing means like a process involved in the review and the adjustment of the collected data. The process known as the editing of the data. And different methods of editing. There's interactive editing and the selective editing, macro editing, and the automatic editing. And macro editing point of view, there's aggregation method and the distribution method. What is interactive editing? Interactive editing, that means use the modern, the computer assisted manual editing. That means using the computer devices for the purpose of the editing. And selective editing is a part of the interactive editing. That means suppose your time is constrained, can be used selective editing instead of the interactive editing. Third one is macro editing, that's aggregation method, distribution. And aggregation method is verifying the figures you published, and the distribution characteristic, the distribution of the various variable. And automatic editing means edited by the computers. So these are different types of editing. Now objectives of the editing have their objective: errors, validation, and the information, detection of the inconsistency. These are objectives of the editing. And these are steps regarding the editing. The first, we provide the information to the instructors, and must be ensure the logical relation between this variables steps regarding your editing. And these are the drawbacks of the editing, and these are the purpose of editing: the clarifying, the make omission, avoid the biased editing, check hand ratings. And these are the editing rules, or the editing rules for the editing. So once again, the editing is one of the important element of the data collection. Suppose your collected data must be properly edited, otherwise your analysis will be in the troubles. Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for watching me.